Sunday, June 19, 2022. Welcome to the 19th episode in this series from MeidasTouch and 5-Minute News called The Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. Download the show as audio, in addition to my daily 5-Minute News podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today is senior defense analyst and author of American Fascism and Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Trans But Were Afraid to Ask, Brynn Tannehill. Brynn, hi. Welcome to the weekend show. Great to have you. Finally, been trying to get you for a while, and now you're here. We've got lots of subjects to look at this week. Obviously, it seems like the whole of America has gone crazy in the last week. And so a couple of the stories to look at. I want to talk about Biden going to Saudi Arabia. A lot of criticism of that. This kind of relationship between US and Saudi. We're also going to look at Ginni Thomas calls for her to be subpoenaed after the Washington Post revealed that the wife of the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas communicated with the former Trump attorney John Eastman ahead of the insurrection. But first, I want to look at this executive order that Biden signed this last week. I think it was on Wednesday. He signed it to stymie what his administration calls discriminatory legislative attacks on the LGBTQ community by Republican-controlled states, declaring before a signing ceremony packed with activists that pride is back at the White House. Now, this is a subject that I'm sure is very close to your heart for many, many reasons. In fact, you have a new book coming out next year. Do you want to just tell us about that very quickly?
So my next book is titled My Child Told Me They're Trans, What Do I Do? A Q&A Guide for Parents. And it's essentially questions about having a transgender child answered by parents of transgender children who have affirmed and supported them. And it provides kind of a counter narrative to what you see in a lot of the media, particularly even the New York Times recently, that has platformed parents who have trans kids who don't support them.
So your book would definitely be banned in Florida schools, right?
Oh my goodness, yes, all of them.
All of them. All of your books, yes, including the book on fascism. This is really the issue, isn't it? That and I guess, is this, the legacy of Trumpism is that, we're now dealing and I was just talking to you before we started this show about, how the last 5 years seems to have gone completely crazy. And I think, when it comes to LGBTQ plus issues, that's right up there, isn't it? Because of the rhetoric, and hate crime is the result of that.
So with the Trump administration, one of the first things they did was unilaterally ban transgender people from the military after transgender service had been opened up under the Obama administration. And there was no real research or rationale given for it. It was all post hoc justifications that were dredged up. It was a purely political move to appease the base. And over time, the attacks on transgender people have spread out from trans folks, on things like healthcare for trans minors, bathrooms, trans kids in sports. And now they feel like they have so much of the upper hand, particularly in the courts, that they've expanded it to lesbians, gays, bisexual people as well. And one of the most disturbing things to come out of recent events, particularly out of Florida with their Don't Say Gay bill, is that anyone who says, hey, maybe we shouldn't be banning everything about LGBT people from youth because there's LGBT youth there, and many of them need support because they don't have supportive homes, to label them groomers and pedophiles. And this is the kind of language that usually comes before really, really bad things happen in a society to a minority. And it's also this signal that if a society is falling into fascism or autocracy, that bad things are coming. So for the LGBT community, this has been an unpleasant 6 months and very worrying. So what Biden is doing is very much appreciated, but it's not a long-term fix.
Let's just talk about what Biden is doing. It's effectively an executive order, which arguably
Correct.
He could have done a long time ago, right? I mean, there's no reason why he couldn't have started his administration with this, because, that their hatred towards minority groups had started long before Biden showed up. So, is this a long time coming? I mean, should he have done this sooner? And do you think it will have a lasting effect, or is this just a paying lip service to an issue that he can't really deal with?
So it's a little bit of a combination of a lot of those things. First of all, at this point, everybody and their dog knows that the Equality Act is dead. It's not happening. There's no way to move it through the Senate. It hasn't been brought up for debate, and it never will happen in our system. Right? That would be the most direct way to deal with all this anti-LGBT stuff going on. But literally within the past 6 months, it's ramped up by several orders of magnitude in terms of how common and vocal and vicious it is. So in 2021, I think we've had like 4 times as much anti-LGBT legislation this year than we did last year. So Biden is responding to something that's kind of happened within the past 6 months, but it was building towards this. And unfortunately, it's kind of all he can do at this point, given how the filibuster rules in the Senate and the Republican Party essentially becoming in lockstep with anti-LGBT forces, despite what the support from the public there is from LGBT people. There's really nothing he can do but executive orders. And the scary part is I'm not sure how many of these executive orders are going to survive review by the courts, which, remember, Trump put a lot of people in the courts in his 4 years there with the help of Mitch McConnell.
Yeah. I feel like, when I guess this started with the sports issue, right? LGBTQ people, trans people in sports. This is kind of how this recent debate began in places like Florida, right? Where girls wanted to play in girls' teams and weren't allowed. And so there was a kind of backlash about that. And then before you knew it, they realized that this was like an issue that they could get behind, and actually it would mobilize anger and support. And so then that kind of stretched into books in schools. And it's now become a huge thing, right? I mean, even to the point that Ron DeSantis has taken on Disney for saying that they are pro-LGBTQ+. The issue, I think, that we have with Republicans is it's almost like they don't know anybody who's gay or trans, right? So they can't make these connections. Well, they probably do know people that are gay and trans. They just don't realize that they're gay and trans, or they've blocked it out, or those people are not outwardly gay or trans. Do you think that's the issue, that there's just this lack of exposure? Because arguably, 13% of the population are LGBTQ+.
Yeah, and that number varies a lot depending on what survey you're looking in the methodology. But, looking back at Alfred Kinsey's study going back to the 40s that's saying that 10% of the American public is some form of LGBT doesn't seem to be that far off once you take away the shackles of stigma and discrimination to some extent. But with the Republican Party and Republican base, there are quite a few people within the Republican base who believe American society can only be fixed and become more godly if there are no openly LGBT people. And if I were to take a guess, given how Mark Burns in South Carolina ran on a kill the gays platform and got 25% of the GOP vote in the primary, right? Well, that's about a quarter of the Republican Party is behind removing them from society. Others believe, well, parents, anything that's LGBT is obscene and children should never be exposed to it. Even if it's as much as, 2 women pushing a baby carriage in a Pixar movie. They don't do anything. They just push a baby carriage together, right? And these are the ones that are behind the don't say gay things, that are behind removing all the books from libraries. But it's very dangerous. And you should be familiar with this because it's pushing towards kind of a Section 28 style mentality or law or policy about LGBT people. For those who don't know, Section 28 was a law in the UK that basically banned any discussion of LGBT lives around children in the UK. If I got that wrong, please correct me. But it also, we're looking at stuff that could resemble the LGBT propaganda laws in Russia, right, to protect children. And So what started out as something that was unfortunately popular, if misguided, which was banning trans youth from sports, has morphed into much more openly saying there shouldn't be openly LGBT people in society. Won't someone please think of the children?
I feel like the Section 28 that you're referring to, it goes back to Margaret Thatcher's government.
Yep.
And this was something that happened, I think, in 1998. It caused... 1988, and it ran till the year 2000. I mean, it was like abolished in the year 2000. But the point is that we are living in a society that has this kind of confusion about who people are, this kind of identity politics, right? Where it's not just the politicians that struggle with identity. It's actually, it's voters looking upon other voters for their, who are confused about their identity. And fear. I think fear is behind a lot of this, isn't it? So let's just look at the origins of the fear borne by Republicans or evangelical Christians or whoever it is that's bringing up these types of arguments and pushing for this kind of legislation. It's very important for me to kind of understand what their thinking is. Is it that they just source the Bible and anything that strays from the Bible's teachings, it can't be considered acceptable in their modern society? Or is it just a general hatred of minority groups or anybody who isn't kind of white, Aryan, and heterosexual?
So my book, actually, American Fascism, actually talks about this. And the Republican base is dominated politically by white evangelical Christians. That is their base. That is the people those are the people that they have to make happy if they want to get reelected, if they want to win the primaries, which are, in 90% of the cases, the only election that matters because the general election's already been decided through gerrymandering or the fact that they're in such a red state. And social dominance orientation is where people think that because of some sort of innate or traits that they have as a group, they should be the favored people within a society, right? They are God's people. They are the Herrenvolk. They are the people who should be in charge, right? And the response we're seeing to LGBT people now is kind of the same response that you got during the civil rights movement and during desegregation, where it felt like Black people were being elevated up to the level of white people, and that felt like that they were losing some of the specialness of their place in American society. And for a very long time, LGBT people have been seen as lesser, have been seen as something wrong with them, seen as broken, have been stigmatized and demonized. And seeing LGBT people being raised to be treated as well, or regarded as well by the American public as white evangelicals when you take polling, that's scary to them because it feels like they're being replaced or displaced. It feeds, that's why we're seeing a lot of anti-LGBT stuff popping up in replacement theory. But overall, they feel like they are losing something, that they are marginalized as Christians, and it makes them scared and angry when they see themselves being labeled as bigots for being anti-LGBT. And so they're lashing out and trying to take LGBT people back down to where they think they should be.
They're also branding their own evangelical white Christianity as American, right? They think that they are the Americans, and anybody who is not in that camp is not American. And we see that with, Reclaim America and Take Your Country Back. All this is like, it's code, isn't it, for just one type of person.
So that's very interesting that you mentioned that, and this might be a good segue, but the Claremont Institute, to which Eastman belongs, has been a big advocate for Trump and for the notion that conservatives need to take back control of the United States for at least a generation, if not two, in order to make America great again. And taking control of America, they mean by any means necessary, including January 6th, including subverting elections. But one of the really interesting things is that another author whose name eludes me at the moment, with the Claremont Institute, claimed that less than half of Americans are really American. And he was clearly referring to Democrats. And what is the Democratic Party but a coalition of people, Jews, Muslims, people of color, LGBT people, also more educated white people. That's who they see as the enemy and as un-American. So I think you hit the nail on the head, and it all kind of ties together into this weird outlook that they are the Herrenvolk.
This is something that frightens me, as an immigrant myself. And I actually felt nervous when I was living in the States under the Trump administration as an immigrant. And maybe you did too as a LGBTQ person. Because, when there's an authority that is anti-immigration, anti-gay, anti-trans, you feel unsafe in your own country. And it was interesting for me to be a minority in that way. Now I feel safer, and I'm a permanent resident now, and I'm living under Joe Biden's administration. So I don't feel like I'm going to be picked up and deported or separated from my children or anything like that. But I did think about that a little. How do you feel and think yourself, based on who you are, the country that you've been born into, the country you've served as a veteran now? How do you feel when you see this change in American society? Or maybe it's not a change, maybe it's just going back, this rewind of history.
So I'm going to insert that my wife is an immigrant from Canada, and she has been very much aware that she's treated differently than other immigrants. We lived for quite a while here in the Northern Virginia area in a neighborhood that was full of immigrants. And white English-speaking immigrants are treated very differently by conservatives. They're treated as the good ones. Oh, we want you. We don't want the brown ones.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a big thing. But anti-immigration sentiments are nearly uniform throughout right-wing populist, aka fascist movements around the globe. Look at Hungary. Right. There's another really good example.
We even saw it in Poland, didn't we? With when people leaving Ukraine crossing into Poland. And black and brown people struggled to get across the border, and white people were welcomed immediately. Yes,
and there's been some other things with Belarus, deliberately trying to stir up trouble in the European Union by doing some shenanigans with immigration involving people from African and Middle Eastern countries. So yeah, that's a huge deal. But when I look at the U.S., it's been profoundly disappointing and disheartening to realize that this country has turned against democracy, against the things you thought were important. It has also lost its mind. I'm constantly quoting Jonathan Swift when I say you can't reason someone out of something that they were never reasoned into in the first place. A lot of the beliefs held by Republicans today, including the big lie that the election was stolen, don't come from a rational place. Anti-LGBT animus doesn't come from a rational place. It comes from religion and deep-seated fear and years of stigmatization and demonization of people as these are other, they are dangerous, they're gross. But what strikes me the most is the fact that I don't trust this country if we do fall into authoritarianism. You're probably safe. You're white, I presume cisgender and heterosexual, I don't know. But you aren't in the kind of danger that most LGBT people and trans people feel in particular.
And I caveat what I said earlier with total understanding of my white middle-class privilege completely. And I recognize that, obviously there are varying degrees, but I just sensed under the Trump administration that my dream of moving to America could have been ripped away from me at any point. And, my fear is if he was to return, he could say, right, all green card holders out. He can change the rules and turn on a dime. And so obviously for people who are minorities in America, either born in America or immigrants to America, certainly from the southern border, as Trump refers to it all the time, there must be this constant sense of fear. And my concern is that, why would you want to come to a country where you're just going to feel as aggrieved as you would in the country that you were escaping persecution from?
And I don't know why any sane LGBT person would want to come to the United States right now.
Right. Yeah.
No, I mean, with the end of Roe versus Wade via Dobbs versus Jackson, it's very clear to most, legal observers. I know that Obergefell is probably toast, and Lawrence versus Texas, which held that sodomy laws were unconstitutional, is also probably toast. It's going to be, in 30 plus states of the United States within the next few years, same-sex marriage is going away.
And a few months ago, we heard a Republican senator accidentally say that maybe interracial marriage needs to be something that should be looked at.
And they're already gunning for Griswold versus Connecticut, which held that the government can't interfere with your right to birth control, right? So all these things are going away, but the thing that's really terrifying for LGBT people is that that what comes next is very much directed. What's happening to women is just, it's neglect. It's, oh, you got pregnant and you're going to die because you got pregnant. Right? But it's not designed to drive women out of Texas and Florida. The kinds of things we're seeing with the Republican Party today is designed to make life for LGBT people in red states as miserable and unpleasant as possible in order for them to either go back into the closet or leave. And this is some very middle-class white stuff on my part, but I'm one of the very small minority of LGBT people that has the option of saying, you know what, I'm taking my Canadian wife and we're going to Canada where our marriage is recognized, and my kids aren't going to be taken away because they're living with an LGBT couple.
I fear, Brynn, that we're all going to end up in Canada. So,
I think Canada's...
Everybody I talk to on this subject or similar, they're like, Canada, America without the guns. And I feel like, it sounds crazy, but it's a consideration for a lot of people.
The problem is that getting into Canada or one of the Commonwealth nations is extraordinarily difficult. I have a code worker who's 40-ish, has a master's degree, years of experience in government and industry, and she tried to find out if she would be eligible to move to Canada, and the answer was, no, you don't have enough skills and education to live in Canada.
Yeah. I fear as a British person, I would also struggle to get into Canada as well. I just want to talk about the hate crime that we're starting to see, not just in the US, but around the world. And arson, New Zealand, Detroit, Baltimore, all in the last few weeks. Do you think, there's people with pride flags outside their houses, or this is, community centers that are used for LGBTQ plus events? Is there a connection between these types of crimes now?
Yes. I honestly believe that the kinds of tactics that were used against abortion clinics and against abortion providers are going to be utilized against LGBT people. And we're seeing it already. A lot of arson. We saw 3 homes in Maryland burned to the ground. 3 people in the hospital because somebody decided to set one of their pride flags on fire. We saw the oldest gay bar in Detroit burned down. Yesterday, we also saw an LGBT center burned. We saw Patriot Front looking like they were going to being charged with attempting a riot at a pride festival in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. We're seeing candidates more openly talk about trying LGBT people for treason and executing them. The hate is there, but what's really worrying to me is I'm starting to see counter tactics that use the same sort of thing. We've seen a few pregnancy crisis centers, which are basically religious organizations that only a few of them actually provide medical services. They exist to prevent people from getting abortions. We've seen a pair of them burned by a group calling itself Jane's Revenge. And the fact that almost no one gets caught for arson leads me to believe, and the growing frustration and fear leads me to believe that we're going to see increasing violence on both sides. But at first, it's LGBT people and LGBT centers that are going to be bearing the brunt of this.
I mean, this is the kind of civil war that some of us have been predicting, right? It's like, we didn't really know who would be on what side. We thought it would be as simple as Republicans and Democrats, and it really isn't, is it? I mean, this is quite nuanced. And from what you said earlier, with women's healthcare being removed, women are now going to move into the same group as LGBT, where women are considered a minority group from the mindset of those white evangelical Christian Republicans who are seeking to rewrite society and reconstruct society. Would this have happened at the speed and the rate that it has if Donald Trump had not been in the White House for 4 years? Do you feel like he kind of galvanized this level of hatred, or was it coming anyway?
It was always there, and the Tea Party was always deranged. It was always out of touch with reality. It was always nuts and angry. But what Donald Trump did is he unleashed it. He opened the Overton window such that Republicans realized, oh, wow, given all the polarization, given the gerrymandering, given the voter suppression, I actually do better if I come across as crazy and mean and pandering to the base than I would if I come across as a moderate Republican. And that holds true in virtually every red state. Now, the two most popular governors in America were a couple of moderate Republican governors in Maryland and Massachusetts. But that's not the Republican Party. The future of the Republican Party are people like Ron DeSantis, who are essentially fascist culture warriors, right? Donald Trump just served as a way of showing the path that this isn't political suicide to say horrible, crazy, nasty, stupid things. This is a way to generate support
and to generate wealth, because we're now seeing through the January 6th investigation that, this fund to save America, this fund to kind of fight against election integrity was all just going straight into the pocket of Trump and the Trump organization and associated businesses. And so really, this is a massive con, isn't it? This isn't just about applying this kind of antiquated thinking about minority groups. This is also this is a grift. This is about making money. This is about fundraising for campaigns. This is the lowest form of humanity, is it not?
It is a grift. There is money to be made selling crazy and mean, and even sometimes putting a veneer of intellectualism on top of it. You've got your Matt Walsh's, your Ben Shapiro's, your Candace Owens's. For gosh sakes, she suggested back in February that the U.S. should invade Canada in order to liberate it from Justin Trudeau. And if she wasn't serious, well, then it's obviously a grift. And if she was serious, considering how many followers she has, that shows you just how dumb, crazy, and scary the base is and how deranged it is, right?
And I think deranged is the right word, because, I've been trying to analyze people like Candace Owens for a long time, trying to work out what it is, how, especially for a black woman to have these extreme views. But the fact that she's eloquent, and the fact that she's beautiful, and the fact that she has a platform, she has a vocabulary and clearly has an intellect, but it's the deranged element that for me was the kind of common denominator with all of these things. It was like, wow. And this is maybe the legacy of Trumpism, isn't it? Because if you elect a grifter, somebody who's never really worked for anybody or been held accountable by anybody in their lives. Trump never had a job, right? He was given money by his father. He set up the businesses. He lost a load of money. We know the whole story now. But fundamentally, he's never, ever been held accountable. He's never held public office. Nobody has ever turned around to him and said, no, you can't do that, or no, you can't say that. When you take a character like that and put them in the Oval Office and put them on a pedestal, that arguably the highest pedestal in the world, and give them credence, give their crazy views credence, give Candace Owens credence because she's given a platform, whereas in previous years, somebody who was as deranged as that would never be given the opportunity to speak out. But now we have the internet, and now we have TV channels that are very willing to give people like her a voice. This, to me, is the legacy of Trumpism. It's effectively opening a Pandora's box of insanity.
And what separates the modern Republican Party from the Republican Party of old is in 1964, even Barry Goldwater made the conscious decision he wanted to keep the John Birch Society folks at arm's length. They wanted to keep the crazy at arm's length. And Nixon, when you look at his Southern strategy, you look at his war on drugs, right? There was a recognition that you had to at least pretend to care, that you have to pretend that this wasn't about race, right? And even Lee Atwater in his N-word, you can't say N-word anymore, acknowledged that you have to cover up what you're trying to do with economics and, protecting white kids and stuff like that, right? The GOP today has taken a half step towards reversing what Atwater said, right? They're murderers, they're drug dealers, and some, I assume, are good people, right? Is coming very dangerously close to, reversing what Atwater said of you can't say the N-word anymore. Well, so what has happened with the GOP is that instead of keeping the crazy at arm's length, as Reagan did with a lot of the white evangelicals in the moral majority, and Bush did at times too, the second Bush, Donald Trump embraced it, magnified it, gave it a platform and a megaphone, and invited it into the White House to determine policy.
Because Steve Bannon was one of these people, right? From the outset,
Bannon's he was a great example.
He was the first person into the White House as a chief advisor. And famously, when Bannon left, wasn't there very long, but when he left, he said that really all he wanted to do was cause chaos in America. It's the chaos that they crave, because if there's too much noise, then nobody really knows what to think.
And conservative Christian political groups had access to the Trump White House that they never had under Bush or Reagan or the other Bush or Nixon, right? Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council told the New York Times back in late 2017 or 2018 that he had access to the White House like he'd never had before. We know from the fight for trans-military that the religious right very much had a seat at the table in that sort of decision-making process for the Department of Defense personnel policy, right? So yeah, they have decided that they are letting in the Stephen Miller and the Steve Bannon and the far-right religious fundamentalists, and they are going to let them run the country.
Just because someone puts on a suit doesn't mean that they are to be trusted. And I fear, Bannon barely put on a suit. He wore 2 shirts and no jacket. But Miller is a very good example because he was very much in the shadows, wasn't he? And yet Miller arguably was the most extreme far-right protagonist. How do we come back from a country that spent 4 years under this kind of administration?
So I wrote a number of articles for Dame Magazine, and I've got a series of 5 articles coming out at the New Republic that discusses this. But I've got a rather grim prognosis, is that I laid out the things we needed to do back in January 2020 which was essentially we needed to hold Trump and his administration accountable for January 6th and for any crimes committed while in office. And we needed to pass voting rights legislation and election security legislation in order to protect the rights of minority voters and protect election integrity. And because of the filibuster, because the Republican Party has decided that they would much rather have power than a democracy, none of these things have happened. And I'm also going to throw some at Merrick Garland, right? There has not been an aggressive enough push to prosecute Trump and those around him for the events of January 6th or other crimes committed while he was in office. And as a result, this sends the message that if you're the ones in power and you commit crimes, you can commit as much crime as you want to in order to stay in power. And even if you do somehow manage to lose your hold on power, you're not going to be in trouble. Nothing's going to happen to you. It's going to be the foot soldiers who are going to take it in the teeth. And Viktor Orban in Hungary gives a great example of once you have achieved competitive authoritarianism, and notice that the Republicans are holding CPAC in Hungary, it doesn't look like anything short of Romanian-style revolution is capable of removing such a party from power. There are no modern examples of competitive authoritarian countries falling. Once they seize power, it's theirs.
Let's talk about January 6th committee for a moment. More hearings this week. I personally have found the primetime hearings compelling. I'm sure you have too. But the Washington Post published an article in the week revealing that the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas communicated with former President Donald Trump's attorney, John Eastman, the man in the hat, who is increasingly looking like very much the mastermind behind this insurrection. And so there's calls for Ginni Thomas to be subpoenaed. They said that she spoke with Mr. Eastman, who tried to pressure the former Vice President Mike Pence to overturn the election results. Two of the people said that the correspondence was more widespread than previously understood. This is all, it's very messy, isn't it? Because, Clarence Thomas and Ginni Thomas are pretty much the same person. That's how I see it anyway. She refers to my friend, doesn't she, in some correspondence, and of course that's her husband. Publicly, they've both said, oh, well, our personal lives, our professional lives, they don't intermingle. Well, obviously that's not true. And this is like payola, isn't it? I mean, this is like old school bribery. This is like having a person on the inside, except your person on the inside is the person who sits in the highest court in the land. There's questions and calls for Thomas to recuse himself from, anything associated with the insurrection, cases that come through the Supreme Court. Or should he just resign? I mean, so there's a few questions for you here. Should Ginni Thomas be subpoenaed? Should Clarence Thomas step down from the Supreme Court? I mean, that's clearly not going to happen. I mean, how do we make sense of this? This is madness, isn't it?
It is madness, but it's not. What we are seeing is known as institutional capture, right? Institutional capture means basically if you think of democracy as a game between two or more teams, what they're doing is they are tilting the playing field through gerrymandering and voter suppression, but they're also capturing the referees so that they don't call the game straight. And the thing is you can't do anything about the referees. You can't fire them. You can't fire Justice Thomas. You can't fire Ginni Thomas. She can be brought in and subpoenaed and questioned, but the ability to prosecute anyone seems a little bit iffy. There's a big question of, great, well, these hearings are laying out a pretty great case of what actually happened, but what is anyone going to do with it? And the answer is, no one knows, and there's doubts whether or not anyone is actually at the DOJ is going to pick this up and run with it. And at the same time, we know that the committee is going to be disbanded after this November as Democrats lose control of the House. This seems to be high probability event. It's very, very rare for the incumbent party not to lose seats in a midterm. So you asked as well, should Thomas recuse himself? Like, well, yeah, but if wishes were fishes, beggars would be kings.
Yeah.
Or to use a quote Chuck Yeager once used with me was, if a frog had wings, he wouldn't bump his ass when he hopped. And this is part of my overall pessimism, is that we have gone so far down the rabbit hole. The system has broken so badly. The guardrails are so damaged. There is so little will to fight against this. There is so much belief by Democrats that the system will still redeem itself or is capable of fixing itself, that nothing is really happening, that there is no sense of urgency among Democratic leadership. And it's only a few, a handful of fascism scholars like Jason Stanley, and in particular, Levitsky, Way, and Ziblatt, and others who wrote an open letter saying, our democracy is almost dead, fix it, do something, a year ago, and nothing's been done. There's this odd cabal of Cassandras who, for whatever reason, recognize how bad things are and how vanishingly small our opportunity to fix this is and how quickly it's disappearing.
I worry that, I said this when I spoke with Alison Gill last week, that, in the same way that Bill Barr paraphrased the Mueller report and rewrote it on a podium because he knew that nobody had read it, there'll be some kind of selective memory going on with these hearings and this investigation, because of course anybody who is on the right gets their news from Fox or OAN or Newsmax or any of these echo chamber spaces, doesn't think anything has really changed. This investigation has been painted as being just a bit of a joke, nothing new to see, and yet every day we're hearing about new evidence, whether it be someone giving a tour to people the day before the insurrection, or indeed this week, which I find most interesting, this idea that Trump was effectively committing a financial fraud by raising money and the money going into his own pocket and not where he said it was going to go. I mean, do you think that there's a chance that Trump and his cohorts could be prosecuted on a technicality like that, something not as theatrical as an insurrection, but something more clinical as campaign finance law?
I think that there's a chance that Trump could get caught up in raising money for his, election defense fund or whatever he was calling it, and be caught for fraud. But it's going to take a fairly committed, and I'm looking for a better term than ballsy, but that's the best I could come up with, prosecutor to decide that they're going to take this on. Looking at the January 6th hearings themselves, there's dropping some great information. The problem is America is so polarized that all reason has been lost. An example I'd use is Herschel Walker is an objectively awful candidate, right? He's virtually incoherent in interviews. He's anti-LGBT. He's a hypocrite about fatherlessness, as it's come out that he's fathered 2 children out of wedlock and hasn't supported them. He has no concept of the issues, and he's still tied with Warnock in the polling, right? Similarly, we've talked about the alternate reality that Trump supporters exist in. And when you look at the people who are Trump supporters and the January 6th hearings, very few of them are going to have their minds changed because, as you mentioned, a significant portion of them aren't going to hear about it, are going to get misinformation, half-truths, and such from Fox News. So they're going to treat it as a nothing burger, or they're still going to believe that it was really Antifa or an FBI sting or something, that it's not real. This wasn't a real insurrection. They're going to buy the party line. They're going to buy the Fox line. And what's worse is that there's going to be a significant percentage that say, yes, this absolutely was a coup, attempted coup, and God, I wish it had succeeded.
That's the tragedy, isn't it? That actually, for those of us who believe in democracy, who are pro-democracy, and I think of myself as a pro-democracy person, not a Democrat. I don't get to vote in this country, but I am very pro-democracy, and I fear that the supporters of Trump, the Republicans who are behind this, they actually see January 6th as one of the great days, as Trump said himself, one of the greatest days, greatest things to happen. And, it's more of a celebration than to them than it is to anybody else. And I guess this is that line of, I don't really see it as political. I see it as sanity and insanity. Because, you have to know a little bit about the world and about other democracies that have fallen, or, and anybody who's seen active service, who's been in Iraq or Afghanistan, recognizes what life is like under different types of regimes. And yet we have this fascist regime that is very much on the horizon here. Certainly, I have fears for 2024. And yet, it's almost like they will not benefit from what they wish for. The poor don't benefit from a fascist regime.
So there's a quote by Lyndon Baines Johnson about this that sums it up pretty well, because the white evangelical South was what it was in 1964, and it is what it is today, behind Donald Trump. But he made a remark, and I'm paraphrasing here, that says, even the lowest white man will let you pick his pocket so long as you're hurting black people worse, right? Was kind of the gist of what he was saying. And as most Trump supporters feel like in this culture war, that as long as somebody's fighting the culture war for them, they're getting ahead, that their place in society is being restored. And they might not think of it intellectually that way, but emotionally that's how it's coming across for them, that this is, when Donald Trump talks about winning, yeah, this is winning to them. If there's no more trans people in the military, there's no more trans people in schools, there's no more gay people getting married, that's winning. How does that make their lives better? Doesn't matter. That's winning, because it's restored their position within society.
And it's so sad because a lot of these people are so poor, and Trump's policies does nothing for them.
Actually, I'm gonna yes and no. One of the really interesting things that came out of analysis of Trump supporters during the primaries in 2016, and you can go to 538 for this, was they found that not only were Trump voters better off than the average American, but they were better off than the average Republican, right? That this is a white middle class kind of aggrievement movement. Yes, it appeals to poor white people, but it also appeals to a middle class that's had more advantages in life and therefore has more money than similar cohorts, but being older and whiter gives them an economic advantage over the rest of the country in a lot of ways. It's very
interesting. It's the same in England with the support for Boris Johnson. The people that support him will not benefit from his policies. But they just like the populism, the idea that this guy is a winner and says controversial stuff. It, as you say, it emotionally chimes with them, and they would rather that than actually somebody who really cared about democracy and about supporting those who are in need. And I've always been fascinated at this desire of some Americans to ignore collective responsibility and the fundamentals of socialism, where you basically everybody benefits if everybody is looking after everybody else, and it's not really a thing here. Socialism is it's as scary a word as the fascism word that nobody uses either. Let's finally just talk about Saudi Arabia, because this is Joe Biden's planned trip to visit Saudi has been criticized because as a candidate for the White House, he labeled Saudi Arabia a pariah and pledged to recalibrate the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Well, after taking office, the administration made clear the president would avoid direct engagement with Prince Mohammed and focus on King Salman. He's now going to meet Prince Mohammed in Jeddah at the end of a 4-day trip beginning on the 13th of July. I also remember that there was this weapons deal selling arms to Saudi. Of course, Saudi, a huge customer for American arms. Same with the UK. The UK sell arms to Saudi quite happily. And I really thought that Biden would cancel this deal that Trump had done with the Saudi government to buy arms. And he didn't. It was allowed to go through and it was ratified by Congress. I mean, what's happening here? How do we balance this kind of contradiction between Saudi and their human rights atrocities and also arguably their involvement in 9/11? I mean, you know, many of those bombers were Saudi nationals, and that always
15 of the 19.
15 of the 19, and that always seems to be, you know, ignored because we were distracted with weapons of mass destruction. So how do we qualify this? And is Joe Biden doing the right thing, or is he just not saying it in the right way?
So there's a lot going on here. Part of it is trying to, without talking about the Ukraine situation too much, some of this is trying to keep a lid on the Ukraine situation. Some of this is with what's going on in Ukraine. Oil prices, if you might have noticed, are kind of high. There is some price gouging going on, but we are seeing prices per barrel being as high as they were back in 2014. And Biden is under pressure to keep OPEC's spigots open, to try and reduce oil prices. And part of the Democratic Party's needs for the election in November is to do anything they can to get oil prices down, because inflation and oil prices have been kind of a number one, bread and butter, breakfast table, talking point for the GOP. So in order to have any influence with the Saudis, he's kind of caught over a barrel, and the Saudis know exactly how much Biden needs them more than Saudi Arabia needs Biden. And as much as we hate to admit it, Trump had good relations with Saudi Arabia because he let them do pretty much whatever they wanted, and sold them the weapons they asked for, right? And there's been really no consequences for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. So this is, in some ways, we're not letting morals get in the way of political necessity. Now, how you feel about that? Well, I don't know that there's any good answers, other than, yeah, okay, we could stick it to Saudi Arabia and then we'd have, $7 a gallon gasoline.
The gas price thing is interesting, isn't it? Because originally Biden started referring to it as Russia's price hike, right? Trying to blame the war on Ukraine for the high gas prices, and people didn't really buy that. Meanwhile, Robert Reich tweeted the other day that big oil's first quarter profits, Shell, $9 billion, ExxonMobil, $8.8 billion, Chevron, $6.5 billion, BP, $6.2 billion, and suggested why not a windfall profits tax? I mean, is not part of the problem here that actually there are American companies making huge profits and using the price of a barrel of oil and the war in Ukraine as an excuse for making up the profit that they claim they didn't make during the pandemic and during lockdown when fewer people were driving? There, as you say, there is a lot to this, but I fear that maybe these are separate issues. And what Biden is going to the Middle East to do is probably slightly different to what he's telling us. I mean, there must be other reasons for his trip, because it's not all about gas prices, is it?
No, it's not all about gas prices. There are things with Israel and national security and other areas of national security that I really can't go into here. But there is a lot going on, and the relationship with Saudi Arabia is a long, complicated, and ugly one. I mean, particularly when you consider that they've been our bulwark against Iran since 1979, 1980, them in Iraq. So there's a lot of moving pieces here, but it doesn't change the assessment that we need Saudi Arabia more than they need us, and they know it.
I fear, because I used to think about this when I lived in England as well, because there was, England's two biggest exports are, I think, oil and gas followed by arms. It's like you just can't win. And it's the same here, isn't it? The military, this kind of trade of military equipment, it's massive. It's worth a fortune. I mean, even American presidents boast about these deals, 600 million and here and there. It's like, there's a lot of money to make. There's a lot of profit to be had. And it's almost as if every country has its price.
And to some extent, yes. You look at Europe and what's going on with Ukraine and Russia. The Russian oil and natural gas are definitely a critical factor in their reasoning, and we know what the moral correct thing to do is, and that's not happening for economic reasons. So I would say that this is not a unique conundrum to the United States, and Biden is probably going to give a lot more weight to what happened to Jamal Khashoggi than Donald Trump did, but it's still not a particularly great place to be from an ethical standpoint. Now, the solution would be, wow, what if we invested in other kinds of energy, and energy, not just energy independence, but getting away from fossil fuels altogether? And wow, that would be great. And Biden's energy bill is essentially dead on arrival with the Senate, because that would get in the way of profits with the oil companies. And so are windfall taxes. They're dead on arrival as well. Right.
And it's tragic. I actually just drove across the country from Texas back to California. And it was very interesting, seeing the landscape, thousands of miles of just wasteland, effectively, that would be ripe for solar panels, that would be ripe for wind turbines. I got to see wind turbines when I eventually got to California. They were everywhere, and it was amazing. And I also saw Solar City. I saw these huge solar farms. And this is land that is not used for harvest. This is land that is otherwise, salt flats or just wide open space, public land. And I often think how amazing it would be if, America was able to paper all of this land that wasn't being used and wasn't a necessity to the ecosystem or to wildlife, or worked with wildlife, because they can do that now. They can create solar farms that enable the wildlife to coexist. If we just covered the whole country in it, and we were all able to drive electric, and we were all powered by the sun. I mean, it's totally possible. But the three words Green New Deal are just as offensive to Americans as these words like fascism that we've referred to earlier. And it's such a tragedy, because it's all about money, isn't it?
It's not just about money, it's about culture. Anytime somebody suggests that maybe we should, use a little less gasoline, you immediately get calls of socialism and communism, and they're going to take away your car, and they're going to, or they're going to make you drive a Vespa to work, or, just outrage, or they're going to force you to stop eating beef, or it immediately gets demagogued into the ground. And just like virtually every other topic in American society today, you cannot have a rational discussion about energy policy, because one side is absolutely committed to the idea that either global warming doesn't exist, or it's so mild that nothing's going to happen, or it's inevitable, so we should just, build a 100-foot wall around America's seacoasts to keep the water out, right?
Yeah. Meanwhile, the evidence is all around us, and we only have to look to Yellowstone National Park this week and see rising waters flooding into Montana, and this is climate change, and Mother Nature is showing herself day after day.
Yeah, fewer than half of Republicans see anthropogenic climate change as real, and only a tiny fraction see it as a significant problem. And the vast majority make fun of it. For national security, one particular defense official called global climate change is one of the biggest threats to American national security, and he got laughed at. But that's because, it's getting hotter. Oh no, the military won't function. Whereas actually there was some very good reasons why, including if we're planning on confronting China in the Pacific Rim, we need runways and bases that aren't underwater.
Yeah, I mean, and this is what, I mean, the media has failed enormously in this. You know, I watched a report. It was like a 7 or 8 minute report that CNN did the other day about Yellowstone. And they didn't mention climate change. They didn't mention the climate crisis. It was not part of the package. It wasn't even mentioned when they cut back to Anderson Cooper, the highest paid journalist on American television. Didn't mention climate change, despite this, you know, emotion, feeling, this is terrible, people won't be able to visit Yellowstone, you know, they normally come here for vacation. That's what they were caring about. They were caring about the people that won't be able to enjoy a holiday, instead of the fact that really the planet is burning. But, you know, all of these freak weather events now are signals to us that our time is up. Our time is up, Brynn. That was a painful segue, but I think I got away with it. I'm very grateful that you have joined us here on the Weekend Show. And good luck with your book that comes out next year. That's Brynn.
Thank you very much.
Of course. That's Brynn Tannehill. I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast, and also the 5 Minute News Daily podcast, which drops every morning, so you can hear me tell you about the news of the day whilst you're making your morning coffee. Join me next Sunday morning with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with MeidasTouch.